The 85-year-old Ringo Starr's birthday celebration alarmed fans. During his yearly peace and love moment, the drummer for the Beatles started crying. He became ill and had to postpone performances in New York and Philadelphia. The doctors advised him to take it easy, but there seemed to be a deeper issue. In his birthday address, he openly lamented John and George for the first time. As he said, his voice broke. Why is everyone so worried about what's actually happening to the last Beatle left? On July 7, 1940, Richard Starkey was born in Liverpool at 9 Madran Street. German bombs were dropping on the city nearly every night during that summer. Everything around his parents was trembling, despite their best efforts to remain composed. Additionally, his father, Richard Starkey Sr., a baker, was already beginning to lose his mind. Richard's father departed when he was 3 years old and never returned. Suddenly, Elsie, his mother, had to raise him by herself. To pay for food and rent, she worked as a cleaner during the day and as a barmaid at night. They had to relocate to a less expensive location in 1944, since they were unable to keep up with the expenses. Then something worse happened. Richard's appendix burst when he was 6 years old. It appeared to be simply another procedure at first. However, things went horribly wrong. He contracted peritonitis, a potentially fatal condition, and spent days in a coma. Nobody knew if he would survive. He spent nearly a year away from his mother in the hospital. At the age of 8, he was unable to read or count correctly when he was eventually released in May 1948. He didn't grumble, though. He simply continued. He had begun receiving tutoring to catch up in school at the age of 13 when catastrophe struck once more. Richard became ill during a TB pandemic that hit his school in 1953. He was admitted to a specialized hospital and need to remain there for 2 years. It was solitary. Just silence, no school, no friends. However, a nurse once handed him a cotton bobbin mallet and instructed him to use it for amusement by striking it on a metal cabinet. Something inside him was ignited by that sound. He was unable to stop listening to an album called Bedtime for Drums that a health worker had given him. He had never felt like he had anything of his own until that moment. He was raised in one of Liverpool's most challenging neighborhoods, Dingle. It was dangerous and full of gang fighting. In the end, Richard joined one only to live. Nearly every week he witnessed beatings, and one day a competing group attacked him so severely that it permanently altered his perception of himself. He was quiet and small already. However, he became even more uncertain about his position in the world following that. His escape was music. It gave him a sense of purpose and motivation to continue. At the age of 16, he was hired as an apprentice machinist at a business in 1956. He met Roy Trafford there, who was a huge fan of skiffle music, a genre that combined blues, jazz, and folk. Together with another employee named Eddie Miles, they established a band and practiced in the factory basement. Richard received a used drum equipment for Christmas 1957 from his stepfather. He joined the Eddie Clayton Skiffle Ensemble 2 months later, and on July 31, 1957, he performed in his first actual gig at the Cavern Club. He played music at night and worked at the factory all day. It was everything that truly made him happy. He was invited to join the Hurricanes, another group, in November 1959. He had a real drum kit which they required. Shortly before he arrived, they renamed themselves Rory Storm and the Hurricanes. He began referring to himself as Ringo Starr at that point. He seemed like someone who was meant to be seen because of his numerous rings and star. They referred to his solo performances as Star Time, and he performed songs like Boys by the Shirelles. In Liverpool, Rory Storm and the Hurricanes were more well-known than the Beatles by 1960. Hamburg followed. They were scheduled to perform in the red light area of Germany in October 1960. The city was crazy. It was dubbed the world's naughtiest city by George Harrison. According to Paul McCartney, every lady there was either a prostitute or a dancer. They drank constantly, took drugs, played all night, and slept very little. There was mayhem. Paul and drummer Pete Best were jailed on November 29, 1960, for burning a condom that they used to illuminate their dimly lit chamber. On December honest, they were deported. Despite the chaos all around him, Ringo managed to live. When Pete Best was unable to make it, Ringo made his first recordings with John, Paul, and George during this period. They were backing Lou Walters on the song Summertime on October 15, 1960. Years had passed before the Beatles were well known. While Ringo and his band were struggling to make ends meet, they recorded Cry for a Shadow with Tony Sheridan later in 1961. They had no reliable source of income. Ringo even considered relocating to America in search of better opportunities. However, he felt a draw in the direction of those three Liverpool youngsters. Pete Best began missing gigs in early 1962. When Ringo filled in once more on February 5, 1962, George Harrison recalled thinking, "This is it." The Hurricanes wanted Ringo on a full-time basis, but he was still bound by his contract. Ringo didn't think much of that one performance, but it was the start of something big. The abrupt termination of Pete Best occurred on August 16, 1962. Ringo became an official Beatle on August 18, but that was not a happy occasion. The fans were incensed. George Harrison arrived at the Cavern Club on August 19 with a black eye after being headbutted in a hallway. While half of the audience chanted, "Pete, forever. Ringo never," items were thrown at the stage by people. Ringo received threats of death. He endured weeks of street harassment. He began to question whether this was really worth it. The recording sessions followed. He performed for unimpressed producer George Martin at Abbey Road on September 4, 1962. A week later, on September 11, Martin substituted Ringo for tambourine and added another drummer, Andy White. Ringo felt ashamed. He believed he was done when he thought, "They're doing to me what they did to Pete." The other Beatles put him to the test, with practical jokes during the 1963 tours. To test his ability to cope with the pressure, they staged emergencies, concealed his drums, and misrepresented showtimes. The band's equipment inexplicably disappeared during one performance in Wales, forcing the entire group to utilize someone else's instruments. Though difficult, Ringo maintained his composure. He gained their trust gradually. Because he utilized a right-handed set and was left-handed, he played the drums in an odd fashion. Although that ungainly arrangement gave his rhythm a distinctive sound, he was constantly concerned that it would make him appear untalented as a drummer. He was afraid of being replaced, so he practiced all the time. It even caused him to lose sleep. However, the Beatles' sound incorporated that style. It gave songs like Please Please Me and Love Me Do a unique vibe. Prior to their world tour, on June 3, 1964, Ringo passed out during a photo session. Doctors determined that he had tonsillitis after his fever reached 102. The band had to choose between replacing him and canceling their most important American performances. Jimmy Nicole was the drummer they brought in. Ringo skipped 8 performances in Australia, Denmark, and Holland. George Harrison threatened to quit the tour because he was so angry. Ringo flew to Australia while still ailing since he didn't want surgery. And on June 15, he returned to the band in Melbourne. When the Beatles landed at JFK on February 7, 1964, one illness almost destroyed all they had worked so hard to create. They didn't know what awaited them. Before the doors opened, 4,000 supporters were already yelling. Unaware that he was about to become a magnet for hysteria, Ringo went out grinning. He quickly became a favorite due to his silly charm. However, the devotion soon became perilous. Only 4 months later, on June 13, 500 schoolgirls in San Francisco went crazy just to see him during a brief layover at the airport. Out of hysteria, 5 of them passed out. Helena Rand, then 18, was the leader of the Beatles fan club in California. Before passing out in Ringo's arms, she was able to gift him a surfing shirt. To prevent him from being crushed on the spot, police had to create human shields. The crowd was barely restrained by 20 officers. Ringo maintained his smile throughout. However, that was only the beginning of what Beatlemania would do to him. He even admitted, "I enjoy it." Ringo's innate humor made him a movie star. During the 1964 night of A Hard Day, without even attempting, he was able to steal entire sequences. But fatigue was hiding underneath the charm. Ringo passed out on a photo shoot on June 3, the day before their world tour. He was sent to the hospital with acute tonsillitis and a high fever. The trip couldn't wait, but the doctor told he needed to relax. He was replaced by Jimmy Nicole, who received $2,500 each show. Ringo believed he was being ejected for good. He watched another person sit behind his drums while he lay in a hospital bed. A week later he went back, but the terror was still there. The Beatles flew to the Bahamas in 1965 to film a video. What they entered felt like a trap, but they had anticipated a fun trip. The locals didn't want a British band to make headlines because of the heated political environment. Throughout the entire experience, John Lennon drank. Later, he described the encounter as embarrassing and claimed that they were continually humiliated by the local officials. He almost lost it and began ranting back at one point. The band was unable to travel without bodyguards due to the increased security. Ringo, who generally mediates conflicts, sensed that tension was increasing hourly. It was no longer enjoyable. It had the feel of survival. Things had escalated to a new level by 1966. The Beatles performed in Manila on July 4 and July 5. Headlines the following morning said that they had ignored First Lady Alda Marcos. In actuality, they never consented to the meal. But that didn't matter in a fear-based nation. The police protection they had disappeared. Escalators at the airport were turned off. Government goons brandishing clubs and weapons in fictitious military outfits forced them to drag their own equipment. A fist was thrown at Brian Epstein. Mal Evans, the road manager, was kicked and left on the tarmac, bleeding. To board a plane, they had to pay 74,450 pesos. They never came back. Ringo felt more isolated than ever by 1967. He felt invisible when recording Sgt. Pepper, yet his drumming on A Day in the Life would later be referred to as legendary. He joked that he spent hours sitting around, while the others experimented with LSD and other sounds. So I learned how to play chess. It no longer felt like a band, according to George. Ringo was keeping time, while Paul was playing the piano. The songs wouldn't have been the same without him, yet he hardly felt involved. On 22 August 1968, something broke. Ringo left Abbey Road on foot. Ringo had had enough of Paul criticizing his drumming on back in the USSR. He confided in the others that he felt inadequate and unwanted. He was astonished by John's response. "I assumed it was the three of you." Ringo took a yacht to Sardinia, and, while sitting by himself at sea, penned Octopus's Garden. The band pleaded with him to return. On September 4, 1969, he arrived to find his drum kit decorated with flowers that read, "Welcome back, Ringo." The silence rule of the band has been broken by Yoko Ono. There are no wives in the studio. Following their collision, John had a medical bed delivered to Abbey Road so she could recuperate as he watched them film. Stuck in the midst, Ringo attempted to maintain harmony, but saw the studio become a battlefield. Heroin was their kind of exercise, Yoko laughed. Nobody chuckled. What Ringo was hearing was unbelievable. Later, McCartney remarked that it seemed as though a fifth bug was present. Furthermore, the medication itself was to blame, not simply Yoko. Due to excruciating stomachache, Ringo was sent to the hospital on September 8, 1969. In the midst of the Abbey Road sessions, his childhood illness had returned at the worst possible time. In private, Paul, John, and George questioned if they could complete the album without him. But it wasn't just the music that made people afraid. They feared losing their friend and drummer. Something changed between them that week. They had a feeling that this would be their final record together. And it wouldn't be complete without Ringo. On August 22 of the same month, Ringo witnessed something even more agonizing. Inside Abbey Road, John and Yoko were restrained in a chair, attempting to give up heroin completely. John shouted and sweated for 36 hours, pleading for help. John snapped at Ringo when he attempted to step in. He claimed that the band was the reason he went. John sat down to write that night. Days later, he was using once more while his body twisted in agony. Ringo was powerless to stop his pal from slipping away. Before things came apart in 1970, Ringo was dispatched with a message to Paul's home. For Let It Be to be released, Paul had to postpone his solo album. Paul blew up. He yelled, stabbed Ringo in the face with his finger and yelled, "I'll finish you now." Ringo silently pulled on his coat and walked away. Their friendship only ever descended into violence once. Ringo later wrote a song titled Early 1970, in which he alluded to how far apart they had gone and subtly ridiculed Paul's agricultural life. Then it took place. Paul announced the end of the Beatles to the world on April 10, 1970. Ringo learned about it from the media. Nobody had informed him. When the music stopped, he sank into a profound depression and sat in his garden, gazing up at the sky, wondering what he would do. Once afraid of being replaced, the man now had to deal with a silence that could not be broken by a drum beat. Paul filed a lawsuit against the others to end their partnership on December 31, 1970. Surprisingly, Ringo sided with Paul. The two others were incensed. They had just asserted that they had handled their issues with Paul. It became official after the litigation. The brotherhood was broken since Ringo had picked a side in the conflict. Early 1970, Ringo's B-side of It Don't Come Easy was released in April 1971. He performed songs about all of his former pals. If George is in town, he might play. If John is present, he might jam. Paul, however, refuses to speak to him at all. His gaping wound, softly leaking through the speakers, was that music. Money was in disarray. For years, the group's income were frozen by Alan Clean, who had pledged to run their empire. Paul had to pay his band out of pocket by the summer of 1971 in order to stay in business. Ringo was powerless over his own income. Due to bad timing and legal holdups, even solo recordings such as Sentimental Journey were buried. The focus was diverted from Ringo's effort to McCartney's LP. One Lovely Moment nearly turned everything upside down. George planned the event for Bangladesh on August 1971. John accepted until he found out that Yoko had not received an invitation to perform. He stormed out of New York 2 days prior to the concert. Paul didn't even want to come. Ringo was the only one present. He smiled through heartbreak as he played with George. It wasn't a reunion, yet the crowd screamed. It was actually a disguised farewell. Ringo's poignant Voyage was released in March 1970. In just 2 weeks, it sold 500,000 copies and peaked at number 7 in the UK. However, its momentum was shattered by Paul's announcement and record release. It didn't gold, and Ringo came to a difficult realization. His background with the Beatles will always be a shadow, no matter how much love he put into his work. Then 1973 arrived. Ringo and George Harrison published Photograph. In the US, Canada, and Australia, it peaked at number 1. It sold more than 1 million copies by December. It was Ringo's greatest success as a solo artist. The Globe applauded as he stood alone in the spotlight for a brief period. Years went by. For the first time in 23 years, he took the stage again in 1989, when he established the All-Star Band. The initial performances were unsteady. Some referred to it as a joke, but Ringo persisted. He performed both his friends' songs and his own favorites. When they saw him behind the drums once more, fans started crying. For more than 30 years, the band continued to tour. He published Vertical Man in 1998. Although Ringo lacked the funds to cover the studio rent, it included George and Paul as well as Ozzy Osbourne and Tom Petty. On the title tune, the secretary who had come to pick up ended up playing cello. "You're killing me, George," Ringo said in a whisper, as George mailed his guitar solos. In 1969, Ringo Starr made his acting debut as the charismatic Christian, portraying a homeless man who was taken in by a billionaire played by Peter Sears. "You've got me crying, you bugger." On paper, it sounded like fun, but it soon became one of the most awkward things he had ever done. Among the many ludicrous sequences in the movie was one in which people dived into a vat filled with blood, urine, and dung to retrieve money that had been dropped into it. Ringo later said that he was ashamed and extremely uncomfortable by the scenes he had to participate in, since they were so graphic, particularly the nudity. The tabloids criticized the movie, claiming it was obscene and vulgar. Most people only remembered the shock aspect, even though it was meant to be satire about greed. The message was lost despite the presence of actors like Christopher Lee, Raquel Welch, and John Cleese following it. Ringo claimed to have learned a difficult lesson about picking his roles more carefully. He joined Caveman, a comedy that appeared ridiculous but ultimately changed his life forever. 12 years later, in 1981, Ringo suffered a severe arm break while filming a stunt, which forced him to take a break from work for some time. However, he benefited from the delay since it allowed him to spend more time on set with his co-star Barbara Bach. They became closer every day, and they were married shortly after the filming was finished. According to Barbara, Ringo's injury and the pressure of the shoot really strengthened their bond. Although the film itself was bizarre and comical, it was the catalyst for one of the longest-running celebrity marriages. Ringo experimented with something very different in the 1970s, furniture design. Together with designer Robin Cruikshank, he founded a business named RO, which stood for Ringo or Robin. They even secured a $10 million contract to furnish palaces in Abu Dhabi and Oman, and they operated out of the Apple Corps building at 3 Savile Row. An authentic Rolls-Royce grill was integrated onto one of their tables. However, purchasers didn't like their upscale taste. At the end, their furniture was left to gather dust at department stores, like Liberty and Harvey Nichols. Ringo suffered greatly when the company failed by the middle of the 1980s, even though he owned 51% of it. He learned from the experience that having a creative vision alone was not necessarily sufficient if no one was purchasing, and the losses were significant. When Ringo was abruptly removed on Thomas the Tank Engine, in 1990, fans were devastated. Since 1984, he had been the narrator and voice of Mr. Conductor, and children had grown up listening to his calming, quiet voice. However, a disagreement over a contract altered everything. American comedian George Carlin took his place after negotiations broke down in 1989. The reaction was immediate. No one else was wanted by the fans. In reference to the fact that Ringo had previously taken the position of the Beatles' original drummer, Carlin himself joked that he was now the anti-Pet Best. Carlin stayed until season 4 and re-recorded Ringo's episodes. However, a lot of spectators felt that something wonderful was gone. At the same time, Ringo's personal life was in a downward spiral. When everything blew up in 1970, his marriage to Maureen Cox had already been troubled for years. Ringo was hardly there, cheating and drinking too much. Then the shocking news arrived. Ringo's own bandmate, George Harrison, was laying in bed with her one night when Maureen happened to wander in. Ringo didn't yell or fight when George later confessed, in front of him, after dinner, "I'm in love with your wife." The end came in 1974, when Maureen discovered Ringo with American beauty Nancy Lee Andrews. He simply said, "Better you than someone we don't know." The official date of their divorce was July 17, 1975. Maureen received $125,000 from Ringo up front, $23,000 annually, and $2,500 for each of their 3 children. Ringo was granted visitation, while she was granted full custody. In the late 1970s, things became more dire. Ringo was using cocaine excessively. He overdosed so severely in 1978 that he had to be taken to the hospital right away. He later claimed that the cocaine destroyed his appetite, causing him to eat very little and drink 16 bottles of wine in a single day. Francesca, his stepdaughter, claimed that because he and Barbara were hiding from the public and drinking and doing drugs on a daily basis, the house resembled a drug den. Later on, Ringo acknowledged that whole years of his life were a haze. Despite seeing pictures of himself performing all around the world, he claimed, "I have no memory of it." The tipping point was in 1988. Ringo woke up one Friday afternoon, stunned and bewildered. His employees informed him that he had so severely damaged the house that they believed it had been broken into. Even worse, they believed Barbara may be dead because she was so battered and wounded. 2 weeks after that horrific incident, they were both compelled to check themselves into a rehabilitation facility in Tucson, Arizona. In 1989, Ringo acknowledged in court that he had a drinking problem since 1982, but was unsure of how to quit. He claimed to have been consuming 16 bottles of wine every day. That one day's anguish and brutality served as the bottom that drove him to get better. Ringo was brought back into the courtroom in 1980. Maureen, his ex-wife, sought new conditions for support and custody. He was portrayed by her attorneys as an outlaw addict who was unfit to be trusted with his kids. She also compared him to the cartoon drunk who constantly cheated on his wife, calling him a sodding great handicap. The legal battle became heated, despite Ringo having granted her full custody in 1975. Maureen lost and had to pay more than $200,000 in legal fees. According to the judge, Ringo had been generous and had willingly raised her annual contributions. But his life's instability was exposed to the public. Ringo was still touring in 2024 at the age of 84 when everything abruptly stopped. Doctors advised him to take it easy after he became ill just before a Philadelphia gig. He had to call off the performance at Radio City Music Hall that evening as well as another one. The fans were taken aback. He had performed at the Greek Theater in Los Angeles, where his all-star band had debuted 35 years prior, and had already finished 10 of 12 gigs on his fall tour. He claimed to be in excellent shape and continued to work out daily, but the cancellation served as a reminder to everyone of how precarious life had become. On July 7, 2025, he turned 85 years old. Instead of being a straightforward celebration, it turned into an emotional event for supporters everywhere. Ringo Starr Day was recognized by Beverly Hills. His heartfelt message, however, was what most people remembered. During the midday peace and love moment, Ringo openly lamented George Harrison and John Lennon for the first time. In 2008, there were only 100 fans in Chicago when the annual ritual began. It now covered 30 nations. NASA even assisted in sending his message to and from the moon this year. It was more than just a birthday. It was turned into a monument. And Ringo showed that he wasn't finished yet, just when everyone believed he may slow down. In 2025, he declared that he had completed 2 country albums. One of them was scheduled for publication in 2026 and featured T-Bone Burnett. Ringo chuckled when reporters asked whether he was finally retiring, adding that his children had heard that line for the last 10 years and were tired of it. In recognition of one of the musicians who influenced the Beatles' early sound, The new album would even feature a cover by Carl Perkins. Ringo claimed that he was prepared to leave if someone called with a gig offer. However, despite all of the success and love, 2025 also brought some dark clouds. Millions of dollars had been raised by his art displays, particularly a recent one in Las Vegas, for his charity, the Lotus Foundation. Using a modified Rolls-Royce engine, he produced wild spin art, with all proceeds supporting charities such as addiction treatment and cancer research. Subsequently, rumors emerged from the Pandora Papers. They disclosed that Ringo's royalties and tour earnings were managed by 5 offshore trusts in Panama and the Bahamas. Even though there was no evidence of misconduct, some began to wonder if his charity was being used in conjunction with tax evasion. Ringo said nothing, allowing the numbers to do the talking. Despite the pressure from the media, his paintings continued to generate enormous sums of money for worthy organizations.